It was November 1944. A quartermaster depot near Toul, France, sits buried under a freezing autumn rain. Inside a wooden office, a white officer shuffles through inventory sheets. His eyes stop on a massive deficit. $18,000 in fuel, tires, rations, and cigarettes have vanished over 6 weeks. He drops the pen, grabs a clean sheet of paper, and writes a name at the top. The name belongs to a black master sergeant who has managed the depot for 9 months. The officer does not check the locks. He does not interview the yard workers. He writes the formal charge within 48 hours based on an assumption. General George S. Patton will read that charge before the sun sets, and he will deliver a cold, public lesson that the accuser will remember for the rest of his miserable life. This is the story of what Patton did when an Alabama lieutenant falsely accused a Cleveland master sergeant of theft, and the real thief wore the same uniform. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show when the uniform is the only skin that matters. Master Sergeant Walter Reed was 39 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, and served as the supervisor for the 3rd Army Quartermaster Depot near Toul. He had 18 years of flawless service in the United States Armies, backed by 3 separate commendations for his meticulous inventory management. Reed had spent nearly 2 decades mastering the complex machinery of military logistics, ensuring every single cot, ration tin, and gallon of fuel was accounted for down to the penny. Before arriving in France, he had watched his hometown community rally behind the war effort, enlisting to prove that his precision was indispensable to the nation. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who believed the rules of the army protected those who followed them. Now, he sat on a wooden crate inside a freezing holding tent, staring at a small pocket Bible because his meticulous logging system had been completely ignored, and his family back in Ohio had just received a telegram stating he was under investigation for a massive theft. Lieutenant Buford Ashcraft was 28 years old, an inventory officer from Mobile, Alabama, and an ROTC graduate from Auburn University. Ashcraft believed the military hierarchy existed to maintain the social boundaries he had grown up with, frequently stating to his peers that certain ranks were meant for certain men, and that authority should never be questioned by subordinates. He arrived at the Toll Depot with immaculate uniforms, polished leather boots, and a deep-seated resentment for any black soldier holding a position of responsibility. Throughout his short career, Ashcraft had filed 11 separate theft charges against black non-commissioned officers, completely unconcerned that every single one had eventually been dismissed for a total lack of evidence. He viewed the accusations themselves as a necessary tool of intimidation. To maintain his own lifestyle, he had established a quiet partnership with Master Sergeant Roy Tucker, a 41-year-old career soldier from Pensacola, Florida, who actually ran the black market ring out of the depot. Ashcraft used his rank to sign off on the discrepancies. Tucker handled the civilian buyers, and the two shared the profits while letting the missing inventory accumulate under Walter Reed's name. By November 1944, the Allied advance across France had stretched the military supply lines to a dangerous breaking point. The Third Army was racing toward the German frontier, consuming millions of gallons of gasoline, thousands of replacement tires, and tons of ammunition every single day. In the chaos of this rapid movement, rear area logistics became a prime target for opportunistic criminals and civilian black market rings. Cargo trucks disappeared from muddy roads, train cars were misrouted, and supply depots operated under constant, frantic pressure to keep the front lines fed. Because of this widespread confusion, many high-ranking officers routinely overlooked minor inventory shortages, choosing to focus entirely on the speed of distribution rather than the strict accuracy of the ledger books. This permissive atmosphere allowed corrupt individuals within the supply chain to operate with a high degree of confidence, knowing that a few missing crates would likely be blamed on the fog of war. The quartermaster depots, staffed heavily by segregated units under the command of indifferent officers, became vulnerable points where administrative neglect could easily mask systemic corruption. At the Toul Depot, the daily pressure to move tonnage had created a secondary, invisible pipeline of stolen goods that thrived just beneath the official paperwork. But the meticulous records kept by one honest supervisor meant that the discrepancy could not remain hidden forever, and the resulting paper trail was about to collide directly with the command structure of the Third Army. Captain Henry Marshall, a 34-year-old company commander from Philadelphia, walked into the inventory office with a stack of ledger sheets. He looked directly at Lieutenant Ashcraft and placed the documents on the desk. "Lieutenant, I have reviewed the audit report you submitted on Master Sergeant Reed," Marshall said. Ashcraft did not look up from his paperwork. "The report is complete, Captain. The shortages are detailed, and the charges have been filed." "I see the shortages, Lieutenant. But I also see that Reed's personal logs are mathematically perfect," Marshall said, tapping the papers. "Every delivery he oversaw matches the distribution receipts." Ashcraft leaned back in his chair, a slight smile on his face. "Collared quartermasters have a well-known propensity for the diversion of supplies, Captain. He hid the theft in a parallel ledger, or he simply walked the material out the back gate at night." "Did you interview the gate guards, Lieutenant, or check the signatures of the drivers?" Marshall asked. "There was no need for an extensive investigation," Ashcraft answered, his voice tightening. "The man is in charge of the depot, the supplies are missing, and people of his background cannot be trusted with that amount of temptation. It is a matter of character." Marshall leaned down, placing both hands on the desk. Two of the largest shortages occurred on the 12th and 14th of October. Master Sergeant Reed was in a field hospital with influenza on those dates. "He is the supervisor, so he is responsible for what his men do in his absence," Ashcraft said, crossing his arms. "I have filed 11 similar charges in my career, Captain. I know exactly how these people operate, and the charges will stand." Marshall stared at the lieutenant for a long moment, realizing the man had no interest in the truth. "This investigation is closed as far as you are concerned, Lieutenant," Marshall said. He gathered the logs, walked out of the office, and drove straight to headquarters to bypass the local command. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His jeep pulled up to the front office of the tool depot, the mud structures trembling as the vehicle ground to a halt. The general walked in unannounced. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and the ivory revolvers hung low on his belt. Everyone in the room registered his presence instantly. Straightening into rigid salutes, Patton did not raise his voice. He walked straight to the center of the room and looked at the 2 men who had been summoned to meet him. "Master Sergeant Tucker," Patton said, his voice quiet but sharp. "Come here." Tucker stepped forward, his face pale. "Yes, General." Patton laid 3 distribution slips on the table. "Are these your signatures on these receipts?" "They look like mine, sir," Tucker stammered. Patton leaned closer. "They are yours. These receipts match the exact $18,000 deficit in this depot. Sergeant Reed was in a hospital bed 40 miles away when these were signed. Did Sergeant Reed authorize these removals?" "No, sir," Tucker whispered, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Who helped you move this fuel and these rations to the civilian trucks?" Patton asked. Tucker looked at Ashcraft, his hands shaking. "Lieutenant Ashcraft, sir. He signed the audits. He took half the cash." Patton studied the lieutenant for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Lieutenant Ashcraft, step forward." Ashcraft moved to the desk, his teeth chattering. "General, this man is a liar trying to save himself. You have filed 11 theft charges against black non-commissioned officers during your time in this theater," Patton said, his voice cutting through the damp room. "Every single one was dismissed for a complete lack of evidence. You did not look for thieves, Lieutenant. You looked for targets. You used the race of an honest soldier to mask the criminal greed of a thief who looks just like you. You believed the uniform was a shield for your corruption, but you forgot that the uniform belongs to the United States. You have a choice. You will sign a full confession right now, or you will face an immediate general court-martial that will strip every piece of brass from your chest before you enter a federal penitentiary. Decide now." Ashcraft reached for the pen, his hands trembling so violently he could barely form the letters. He signed the document and pushed it across the table without looking up. Patton took the paper, folded it twice, and placed it inside his jacket pocket. The verdict was delivered in the center of the depot yard, under the relentless freezing rain, before 300 assembled soldiers of the Quartermaster Company. Military MPs marched Lieutenant Ashcraft and Master Sergeant Tucker into the mud, forcing them to stand at rigid attention facing the ranks. Patton stood on the bed of a heavy cargo truck, his voice carrying clearly over the idling engines. On his direct command, An MP officer stepped forward and violently ripped the silver bars from Ashcraft's collar, tossing them into the slush. Next came the rank chevrons from Tucker's sleeves, sliced away with a combat knife. The assembled men watched in absolute silence as the symbols of authority were stripped away, leaving both men in plain, unmarked wool coats. They were marched directly to the back of a waiting weapon carrier, their hands bound in steel cuffs, the smell of exhaust and wet canvas filling the air as the tailgate slammed shut. The truck churned through the deep mud, carrying them toward the stockade to await their general court-martial. The witnesses stood motionless, understanding that the absolute authority of the ledger had been restored, and that a false accusation had earned the exact ruin it sought to inflict. Walter Reed returned home to Cleveland, Ohio, after the war ended, reuniting with Naomi and their children. He never discussed the holding tent or the false charges with his neighbors, preferring to let his actions speak for his character. He worked for 20 years as a chief logistics coordinator for a major Midwestern shipping firm, applying the same flawless precision that had saved his reputation in France. Reed passed away quietly in 1982, surrounded by his grandchildren, leaving behind a family that still proudly keeps his letters and military commendations in a cedar chest. Bufford Ashcraft served 6 years of a 10-year sentence in a federal military penitentiary before receiving an early release. He returned to Alabama in 1951, living out the remainder of his life in a small, bitter world of quiet obscurity. Working as an assistant clerk for a rural lumber yard, he refused to speak to reporters or historians about his wartime service, carrying his resentment to his grave when he died in 1974. Patton never mentioned the incident at the tool depot in his public speeches or his personal diaries, keeping the original falsified receipts locked in the back drawer of his traveling desk until his death. He did, however, write a single line to his wife, Beatrice, in late November, noting that an army could not fight a war if the men who delivered the ammunition were treated like enemies by the men who wore the same flag. Some historians have argued that Patton's swift intervention at the tool depot was driven primarily by his obsessive need for absolute operational efficiency, rather than a deep-seated commitment to racial equality. They suggest that any disruption to his supply lines, regardless of the motive behind it, would have provoked the same fierce, immediate destruction of the officers involved. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that this incident demonstrates a clear, pragmatic understanding of justice, proving that the general would tolerate no internal divisions that threatened the cohesion of his command. What is certain is that the meticulous inventory records of the Third Army remained entirely unbroken for the remainder of the European campaign. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have quietly reassigned the officers to avoid a public scandal? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about when the uniform is the only skin that matters, make sure to subscribe.